Hello again. It's time for another video. This time we are going to look at the Dart programming language. And while this is a Flutter course, we will have a look at the language beneath it, since that is what we are going to use to program Flutter. However, all of you have some previous programming experience, and we will just go through the Dart programming language very quickly. We'll do that in two sessions, this one for the foundations of the programming language and the next one for object orientation. We've already discussed it a little bit, and as we've said, it is a programming language originated in 2011, and it is implemented by Google. As with most programming languages that we have today, it is multi-paradigm, so it has an imperative core, but it is also object-oriented. To make it easy to learn, because getting a new programming language out there and get it accepted isn't easy, it has a C-style syntax that makes most programmers quite welcome. This means that it will look a little bit like Java and JavaScript and so on, less so than, for example, Python, which is another really popular language right now. But if you have any prior experience in any C-like programming language, then you will feel right at home. Dart can compile to JavaScript. That was, as we've said in the introduction, what it was intended for in the beginning, or rather to be a substitute for JavaScript, but then later on to compile to or transpile to JavaScript. However, as we are using it with Flutter, it will more often actually compile directly to some platform-specific instruction set, like for example on Android and iOS. When you install Flutter, Dart will be bundled with it. And this is natural, since Flutter is using Dart as the programming language. And depending on how you install it and on what platform, it's possible that you get it standalone as well. You can try that in a command prompt in a terminal by running Dart -- version. If you get something stating a version of Dart, then you have Dart installed as something that you can use free as well. However, as it states here, we will not use Dart other than with Flutter, so we will move on with this. And as I said in the beginning, we won't cover everything. You know a little bit of programming before, and therefore it shouldn't be too difficult to get into Dart. It will be a quick introduction, and for more in-depth explanations, we have a couple of links here, Introduction to Dart and the Dart cheat sheet. I recommend you looking at both of those, as well as looking into the book, where we have the same division as we have here in the lectures, namely with the basics and then the object orientation. Moving on to code, we need to have the hello world example, and it looks like what you see on screen here now. Void main, and then print hello world, and we have the curly braces, and we have a string with simple quotation marks. You can use double if you like, it doesn't matter. Dart works with both. In this example, we are using the top-level function print, which is always included, and we do that to print out a message. You can use print with Flutter as well, just put it there, and it will print out in the terminal when you run it in debug mode and from a command line or command prompt, as we do when we use the IDEs and so on. And that's a great way to debug the application that you are having. It uses variables as most programming languages, and it is type safe. So the variables must have a data type, but it can be inferred. So we can use var if we like. Like in this first example, var name is given the value Cesatine, and if you don't know who Cesatine is, there will be images in a later lecture, or you can just look it up on the internet. The same goes for the answer variable, which is an integer. So both of these will have a data type, and the data type will not change during the life of the variable. If it is inferred, you can use var, but it is also possible to do, as we can see in the two later examples, to say string name and int answer, if we like. One thing that Dart has put a lot of emphasis on is what's called null safety. Namely, that we need to know if a variable can be or could be null. And in Dart, if a variable is not initialized, it is null. And this is true for any variable, even if they are numerical data types, such as integer. And Dart checks this before the value is used. And with version 3 of Dart, your code has to be null safe, meaning that we need to know whether a variable could potentially be null or not. So a variable can be nullable if we use the question mark after the data type. So int question mark answer, as we can see over here, is a variable that could be set to null, possibly. But we want that as seldom as possible. But to make coding as safe as possible, Dart has a number of null-aware operators. So whenever we could potentially work with null, and the compiler will tell you when you have null unsafe code somewhere, and then you will need to add these special null-aware operators, like the dot question mark, that sets a value if the object to the left exists, otherwise not. And this replaces the if statement that you can see here, if user.name is equal to null, for example. Because we don't want that kind of code, this is a shorthand for working with that. As is the double quotation marks, which sets the value unless it is null. And lastly, double quotation marks and a assignment after that is used then to assign a value if the variable is null. You might not use many of these, but you should be aware of them, and you will hear from the compiler when you don't, and you need to, because Dart 3, as I said, will not allow for null unsafe code. So over here we have a number of examples. So int with a question mark means that we have a nullable variable called a, and with the print statement we check how the double quotation mark operator works, which checks if a is null, then we will not use that value. We will rather use the 1138 instead, so it will be printing that. We can assign the value using the double quotation mark and assignment operator to a value if and only if the left-hand side is null. So in this case, a will now be 1138. If we try that again, we will see that the value to the left is no longer null, so it will not, as we see when we try to assign it 42, it will not work. It will still print 1138 and it will generate a warning. So this is mainly for show. So you will see a lot of question marks in code that you look at, and it's good to understand that this comes from the null safety and the null awareness that's so important in Dart. And it basically helps in creating safer code. The control flow. Yeah, well, like most programming languages, we have for, while, and if. There's also a switch statement and a for in or for each. For collections, it's possible to use break and continue. We have the ternary operator, question mark, colon. And all of these, well, they mainly work exactly the same way as they would in Java or JavaScript or in C or C++ and any other C-like language. You should use var instead of int for integer loops, for example, but it won't stop you from using int in them either. In this example, we have imported .io. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few slides in order to get standard out right, and we'll have a look into what that's doing in just a second. We begin by creating a string called name, and here we could have used var instead, since the string is given at once. It's initialized at once to dinjarin. And then we check with an if statement, if name is equal to dinjarin. And in this case, we see that in contrast to how you do it in, for example, Java, where we need to call equals. Here we can just use the equal signs in order to check if name is containing dinjarin. And it will, of course, check that the data type and content are the same. So it's not possible to mix and match. If so, it will print you are the Mandalorian. And after that, we see a for loop, which starts with var. Could be, as I said, int if you like. It starts from 0. It continues as long as I is less than the length of the name, and it increases 1 each step. So exactly the same as we have in, for example, Java. It then writes out an X on the terminal, and this standard out called to write makes it possible to write everything on one line. So that's basically how you work with the control structures. We also have collections, of course. Collections are ways to have exactly the same kind of data type, variables of that, or values of that inside of something. We have lists, sets, and maps in Dart. And arrays as a concept is implemented as lists in Dart using the lists class, which is generic, but it is also inferred, which we'll see later on, and we'll talk a little bit about generics in the next lecture. This far, you only need to know that a way to create a list is, as the example shows, var list, and then the assignment, and with these angle brackets, we just put the values. These values need, of course, be of the same type, so you can't mix and match strings and integers and floats and so on. They need to be the same type, but as long as they are, we can just use the brackets, square brackets, in order to access or set the different values if we like. And we can see that on the next example, where we create this list and then we print out the first element by calling list1, or the first, so it starts by 0 as we are used to. So 0, 1, 2 are the element positions, and it will print out 1138, which is the first, or well, 0, 1 element, and then we can add another one last by calling the add method for list. So list.add 5 puts 5 last, and then we can also remove 42, which is the 0th element. So remove at 0, and we can just print the list to see the contents, as we can see on the last line there. We can also use strings in order to do this. We can then say that instead of using var, we could say list string movies, but as it is inferred, it's easier to do as in the example, var movies, then we can list the different strings. And this way of listing things in an array is something that you will see a lot in Flutter. And just as we said in the previous examples that we looked at in the previous lecture, the trailing comma that you see after Return of the Jedi is okay to have there, and it's even encouraged to have there because it will help your IDE to format the Flutter code later. So please put that little comma there as well. That was lists, and sets and maps. They work almost in the same way as with other programming languages of this kind. It is that is an object-oriented programming language, but it is still possible to use freestanding functions as well, which makes it maybe a little bit more like JavaScript than Java, where it's difficult to do without a lot of syntactic sugar. The way that they are declared is exactly the same as you would see in any C-like language, like for example C or C++, Java, JavaScript, and so on. We start by the return type, then the name of the function, and in parentheses we have a list of parameters to this function. It is also possible to use arrow functions in Dart. So if you have one-liners, you can substitute them with a arrow and then the expression, and we'll see that here, where we have the add completely implemented. It will just return a plus b, but we can see that on the next line we have an int adder instead, taking 2 parameters as well, but we use the arrow function in order to say that the return value should be a plus b. So for one-liners this is very handy, and as you'll see later on, that happens, if not often, then quite often in Flutter as well, when we just want to do something simple. In main that we have below that, we can see that we create the variables x and y, and then z will be the result of adding x and y, and we print that out, and then z will be the result of calling adder with 1138, and that will print out 1138. As we've seen, it is possible to have in Flutter and therefore in Dart so-called named parameters. Named parameters means that we will use a name for a parameter instead of having them by position. And you can do this by putting the parameters inside of curly braces. And you can have any number of these named parameters defined, and we give them a value by stating the name and then a colon. These are not mandatory to begin with, but if we had required before the declaration, we say that, hey, you have to use this specific parameter. And in Flutter, we usually do all of this with the named parameters with the constructor, but more about that in the next lecture. Here's some examples. Add to, which has two parameters, first and second, and we put them in curly braces, and we put the keyword required before them, which makes it possible to do the function call that we see below, namely z being assigned add to, and then we say first colon 10, and then comma separate as we always do with parameters, second colon 20, and that will print out 30 for us. Lastly, something little about importing and library classes. We've seen some Flutter examples where we always import the material design libraries, and we've also imported Google Fonts, for example, in the previous lecture. And we do that by the import keyword. And if we have a library which is a core library, it has dot before a colon in the name. So, for example, import dot colon math will import the core library math. And it's possible for us to just import parts of the library, specific function or object, or rather class, as we instantiate it as an object, or the class itself, with show. Sorry. So we can say show random, and then we get access only to the random class. But at the top of the program file, we put these import statements. And there are a large number of libraries available in Dart. Please have a look at the library guide, which we link from here, and see that they are responsible for a lot of stuff like I/O, which is a little bit different depending on if you are working in Dart or if you are using Dart via Flutter, where I/O is working differently. But if you look at the library guide and all the libraries, it will tell you whether it works in both Flutter and in core Dart. But we have for HTML, math, and loads of more. And then, of course, by looking at pub.dev, you can see a large number of external libraries that could be used as well. And many of the core libraries work together with the Flutter packages. And then there are a lot of Flutter packages available as well. So this has been a really fast introduction to the core components of Dart. You will need to have a look at some of this in the book or in different other places as well, but you've been given the high-level tour of the most important things. And you might wonder, why use Dart? Why not use something completely different, which is a more well-known programming language? Why not use, say, TypeScript instead of Dart? Well, they've been able to tailor Dart into becoming the perfect mate for Flutter, as both Dart and Flutter are created by Google. And we can see little things like the omission of new, for example, and the trailing commas that we looked at today, which makes Dart even more suitable for Flutter than it would have been otherwise. And also we have some really cool stuff like the null awareness and null safety that's so important in Dart. So overall, it is a really good and interesting programming language. And in the next part, we will have a further look into object orientation in Dart. So with that, thank you very much for this lecture, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.